Great, thank you. Can you hear? Okay, good. So thank you again. It's great to be here again to talk about something that's a little bit related to my talk yesterday, where we were discussing how to be persuasive in writing your papers and getting your papers accepted in journals. Another stage of this process, of course, is the refereeing or reviewing process, as Henrik would prefer me to call it, of your paper and responding appropriately to that, which is also an element of being persuasive. And I'm going to talk about some of the some tips that I and others have for doing this effectively, because I think I had some experience working as a divisional editor, as I'll mention, for a period of time, and I saw exchanges between referees and authors that were not effective. And there are definitely ways to improve your chance to communicate effectively with reviewers in order to get papers published. So I want to acknowledge again a couple of people. This is based a little bit on some talks that we give as part of this course that Cecilia Elliott and I teach at the University of Illinois. We've also been fortunate to have yet another associate editor from the Physical Review B, Manolis Antoniakis, who was an Illinois grad, and he came back and gave yet another physics career seminar a couple of years ago and gave a very nice talk on peer review meets analytics, where he talked a little bit about the review process and his experiences and what he looks for in papers to get them published. So this is you can see the entire presentation here if you're interested. There's also a very nice paper that I found kind of oddly in the Journal of American Academy of Dermatology. It shows you that the reviewing process is pretty universal no matter what area you're in. I read this and I saw that all of the advice that they provide is quite relevant to physics and other fields. So it's worth taking a look at. And I'm going to repeat a little bit of the very nice tutorial that Julie and Laurence gave last night, going over how the review process works, but I'll go into a few more details and maybe talk a little bit more about some advice on interacting with reviewers and with editors. So, before I get started, how many of you have submitted papers and been involved in the dealing with reviewers? Okay. How many of you have served as reviewers? Okay, so not many. So this is a very interesting experience. It can be very frustrating, and one of my sort of bottom line pieces of advice is that you need to work hard to try to keep the emotional element out of interacting with reviewers, because it's not usually effective in persuading them that your point of view is correct. So we'll hear this theme over and over again. But basically in the review process, as Julie mentioned yesterday, you start by submitting a paper, and there's an initial evaluation, which I'll talk a little bit about, which is the internal review by the editor. And that's something that shouldn't be ignored. It's becoming increasingly relevant, and the editors are taking more and more activity in rejecting papers without sending the papers out for review. Once it gets past the editor, there are several rounds of review, usually two. There could be a third, as Julie mentioned yesterday. If the paper is not accepted after that peer review, where this is sent out to anonymous reviewers, then you have the opportunity to appeal to the editor, and this was mentioned yesterday as well. And if that appeal will be sent to, in PhysRev B, they call this an editorial board member. In PhysRev Letters, it's called a divisional associate editor. And this is somebody who will evaluate the exchange between the reviewer and the author and make a decision one way or the other. And I'll talk a little bit about that process. And the final stage, which, as Laurent said yesterday, is a procedural response. So if this gets rejected at this stage, the only outcome you can possibly have is for the editor-in-chief to look for procedural errors. They won't look at the scientific merits of the discussion. So, and my sort of insight into this whole process, which was very valuable, was serving as a divisional associate editor at this stage, and I'll talk a little bit about what the divisional editors do at this stage of the process. So the divisional editors, again, if the paper's sent out for review and the reviewers turn it down after several rounds, and the authors still object for some reason to the rejection of their paper, they can resubmit it to the editors, and the editors will send it out to the divisional editors, usually somebody who's a specialist in the field that the paper is written for. Now, the divisional associate editor functions like an editor. He or she gets the entire history of the paper, including the names of the referees, and can look at the entire response. They see the cover letter, they see every aspect of the paper, and their job is to evaluate that process and make a decision on the paper. They can do this by either just making a judgment on the paper, or they can send it out for further review based on what they read in the reviewer and the author responses. Unlike the anonymous peer review process, everybody knows who the divisional editor is. So if you do make a judgment on a paper, the authors will know it's you. That resulted in me getting 5 or 6 nasty phone calls from people that I knew in the community when I didn't find favorably their paper for review. The other thing that I think Hendrik mentioned in terms of things not to do, there was at least one occasion when a very senior member of a European institute contacted me telling me that they had received an email from somebody thinking that they were the reviewer for their paper. So this is a common thing that you do. How many of you have, when looking at a review, been sure that you knew who that reviewer was? It's a common thing. People always think they know who the reviewer is. Well, my advice is not to assume that, because you're often wrong. There was at least one case where somebody thought a very senior member of the community was the reviewer. They contacted that person and told them they provided some additional information, and this senior reviewer was in fact not the reviewer. They contacted me. They contacted the senior editors and informed them of this exchange, and the editors were very unhappy. So this is something not to really get involved in, because you're probably wrong about your guess as to who the reviewer was. So anyway, this part of the process is not anonymous in the sense that the divisional editors are known to the authors. So what did I learn from this experience? And this is really important. This is one of the reasons why I started giving this talk, because I started feeling that authors were not effectively responding to the reviewers. In many cases, I found that the reviewers' comments were valid and very useful, and I thought that the authors were in many cases responding emotionally to the paper. Now, I understood this completely, having been an author myself. We all know it's very, very difficult when you work very hard for many years on a project. You submit it for review, and it comes back, and they don't immediately accept it, which incidentally almost never happens to anybody. But then they have criticisms of your paper. Sometimes those criticisms are not phrased in a very pleasant way, and your initial reaction is to be very unhappy and to get mad, and to assume that the reviewers don't know what they're talking about, or they didn't read your paper. And what I found was that emotional response was not effective. If you acted on it, at least in terms of responding to reviewers, was not an effective way to communicate with the reviewer to get your point across. And many authors, in fact, did that, and were therefore ended up in this appeals process when they could have very easily, or more easily, have adjudicated the process with a much more logical approach. So one thing I learned was that counter to perhaps many people's feelings, reviewers are actually there in almost all the cases that I saw, really trying to help the authors. They were providing feedback that was valuable to the authors, and that in many cases the authors, because they got emotionally involved in the process, didn't see. And so this is something to keep in mind. When you get your first reviews, which I know are very painful, art is to count to 10, calm down a little bit, and see if there's any merit to what they're actually saying, because very often I found that they were. The comments were actually very valid. The one thing about the review process that I found is that it's an opportunity to get a sense of what the readership is, whether the readership is going to appreciate what you're writing. One of the things I talked about yesterday is what you want to try to do is you want to try to write your paper in an accessible manner so that people can understand the point you're trying to get across, which is in your benefit, right? It's more likely, your papers are more likely to be cited and paid attention to if we can understand what you're saying. The review process is an opportunity for anonymous people to provide feedback that you may not be able to get unless you ask maybe a colleague to provide some feedback. But very often they gave honest feedback that was useful to the authors. And, but the authors sometimes didn't see that. They didn't see the fact that they could look and see and get some sense of what the readership is going to, some weaknesses in the argument or some lack of clarity in the narrative that would have been, that improving on those things would have improved the paper. What I did, when I was a divisional editor, is I would first read the paper myself, and then I would look at the exchange between the reviewers and the authors, and very often I found that I agreed with the reviewers, even though the authors responded very violently to what the reviewers were saying. And so this told me that very often reviewers are trying to provide helpful comments, but the authors were not always willing to listen. So these are things that I'm encouraging you to keep thinking about when you send your papers out and when you get those reviews back, is to at least start with the assumption that maybe the reviewers are trying to help and maybe they're providing some useful feedback, and what could that feedback be? Now, I'm not saying there aren't negative and bad reviews. There certainly are, and we'll talk about how to respond to those shortly, but I think you should start with the assumption that the reviewers are trying to help and not assume that they're not. And that might help you navigate this process a little bit more effectively. So it's useful to make sure you're aware of each journal's criteria for getting the paper published, because this is very instructive. They're always a little bit different, but they're generally the same in many cases. This is for Phys Rev Letters. The 4 things that reviewers are asked to evaluate your paper on is the importance, the broad interest, the validity, and the accessibility. And every journal has a little bit different, but every referee is going to be asked to fill out something like this in order to determine whether your paper is published or not. And it's useful for you as the author to know what these criteria are to make sure your paper satisfies these criteria. What's interesting in all of the different exchanges that I've ever seen, certainly as a divisional editor, and is that papers were almost never rejected because of validity, right? This is the scientific, this is the base of the pyramid in the scientific process. We want to make sure that the research we're doing is correct. And the interesting thing is that almost always the research was done correctly. It was good science, but what usually got the paper rejected was one of these other areas. It wasn't viewed as important enough. It wasn't viewed as a broad interest across a variety of subfields, or it wasn't accessible, which means it was not readable to the audience that it was intended for. So this is something to keep in mind, is you're not going to probably be rejected because your science is wrong. You're going to be rejected because of the manner in which you present your results. Okay, so the first stage of the review process is this internal review, and Julie covered this very nicely yesterday, but let me say just a little bit about this. And this is the advice that I've gotten from Manolis, who gave a very nice talk on this at Illinois. First of all, internal review, just to repeat what Julie already said, is this is the stage that the editors will look at the paper and do a first pass at trying to evaluate whether it should be even sent out for reviewers. And as Julie said, this is a way of trying to reduce the load and the burden on the reviewer, the the reviewers. So if they deem that the external review is needed, and I'll tell you how they what they use to decide that, they will just select the referees that they send the paper out to. And they handle these decisions themselves, but they may talk with other people in the some of their colleagues. They might consult one of the divisional editors for an opinion, but these decisions are handled at the editorial level. Okay, so what, at least according to Manolis, do editors look for to make this decision of whether to send it out for review or not? One of the reasons I emphasized the abstract and introduction in yesterday's talk is this is, according to Manolis, this is what he uses to evaluate as a first pass whether to send it out for review. They look at the abstract, they look at the introduction, they look at the conclusions. They look at the quality of the writing. So they can't make a judgment in general about the quality of the science. They're not going to try to do that maybe, but they are going to look at the quality of the writing. They're going to look at the overlap of the subject matter with what their readership is. So you need to make sure that the area you're writing, and this is something that Julie emphasized as well, is fitting with the journal that you're submitting to. They make a judgment as to the overall importance and quality of the paper, and they do that by looking at primarily the introduction, abstract, and conclusions. And they try to look for a punchline. What's the punchline of the paper? What's the bottom line of the research that's being done? When they do decide to reject without review, Manolis gave a list of things that are usually the things that are responsible for that. The paper is too specialized. It's a marginal extension of previous work. As I said, the subject matter of the paper doesn't match the readership of their particular journal, so it's important to make sure you're submitting to the right journal. Presentation is sloppy. The writing is not clear. The introduction. So the introduction lacks clarity, has no context, describes prior work poorly. It doesn't provide a broad picture. Remember, we talked about the broad picture starting motivation in the very beginning. Too many technical details, no motivation. These are the kinds of things that they looked for that encourage them to reject without review. In the references, they noticed references tended to have too many old references, specialized references, or self-references. In the conclusions, they found no punchline in the conclusions. They couldn't determine what the main message of the paper is, why the paper was important, or how the paper advanced the field. So somehow in your papers and in your cover letter, you need to elicit these things and make sure it's clear to the editors that they can see this. And that's to your benefit anyway, because you want the readers to also see these kinds of things clearly in your paper. Okay, any questions? Okay, so Julie already mentioned a cover letter, but one of the things that's nice is to make sure your cover letter has these things that they look for in deciding whether or not to submit the paper for review. A common organization is in the first paragraph just to describe the author list, the name of the paper, and the journal to which you're submitting, and then a statement of why the research that you're doing is important. Yeah, sure.
Thank you. So is the editor going to reject the paper before sending it to a reviewer? Is because of all the points or because of one of the points?
I would say that's maybe better answered by our editors, but probably at least one, if not, I'm sure they don't require all of them. At least one, maybe one or two, but I don't know whether you need to avoid all of them or not, but I don't think you need to satisfy all of them. I think even just one or two will be enough.
Okay.
And I guess it depends on how badly you violate one of these issues.
I also have a question.
Sure.
I know it's kind of subjective, but what would you consider an old reference? How old?
Well, I
if
think
it
the
were to be-
emphasis is
like
on
I
too,
guess
is on
it
too
depends on
many.
the field. Of
I
course
think
you're
the
working.
emphasis is on too many old references. I mean,
Oh,
I think
all right.
you make a judgment about how old the research is. If all of the references are very dated, there will be an assumption that you're doing old work, right? If you have one or two old papers, I don't think it's an issue. But if all of them or most of them are old, then I think the knee-jerk assumption is going to be that you're in a field which is not topical, and that therefore it's not suitable for the journal. Other questions? In the second paragraph, you want to explain what you did in the study and why the findings, why the research results were significant. Here's where you address this issue out front in the third paragraph of what the overlap between your research is and the specific readership of the journal. So you explain this to the editor so there's no question. And finally, as Julie mentioned, if you list the corresponding author, list referees that you suggest, and maybe referees that you'd like to avoid. Okay, so if it gets past the internal review process, it goes out for review. And the typical responses you can get are these. One which almost never happens, I think it's maybe happened to me once or twice in my entire life, the paper gets immediately accepted. It's very rare, and one of the things I should say is don't expect this. So expect to get a paper, get your paper back with reviews and expectations of changes. And I'm saying that so you don't immediately think that you're not disappointed. Because I have seen students get papers back for the first time and they're immediately despondent because it wasn't immediately expected. And that is not a normal response from the editors. One option is to get accepted with minor revisions. You can get a request for major revisions before the paper is reconsidered for publication, and then you can get an outright rejection. And one thing that's useful to do is to get used to reading between the lines in some of the responses that you'll get from the editors. So let me show you some examples. But one thing that I'll say first is that one of the reasons it's difficult to tell about the decision of the editors, sometimes you look at the reviews and you cannot match what the reviews are saying based on what the editor's decision is because this is something you don't see, is that every reviewer will be asked to sort of check off a recommendation. It could be any one of these. Paper should be published as is, paper should be published after minor revisions, papers with revisions and further review might be publishable, all the way down to the paper should not be published. You don't see this as the author. You do see the reviewer comments. So sometimes it makes it difficult to judge why you get a particular response from an editor because you don't see this response. But you can read between the lines in the responses that you get from the editors to tell what the referee might have checked off here. So the rare immediate accept comment looks something like this. We are pleased to inform that your manuscript has been accepted for publication. Your manuscript will now be prepared for the production process. So eventually you do get something like this, but it usually is after a couple of rounds of review if your paper is going to be accepted. But don't expect to see this after just immediately submitting your paper. A slightly more likely response is the following. The above manuscript has been reviewed by 2 of our referees. Comments from the reports appear below for your consideration. When you submit your manuscript, please include a summary of the changes made. Okay, so what in this statement tells me that this is something that's encouraging? Anybody want to tell me? So it's this phrase here, when you resubmit. Okay, they're essentially telling you to resubmit the paper. So that's a very, very good sign that the reviewer's comments were good and the reviewer gave you a strong recommendation. More ambiguous is if the referee checks one of these possible publication after significant changes. So the typical response you might get here is, we cannot accept your manuscript in its current form, but if you do decide to resubmit, then we would consider only a substantial revision. Or it could also be, if you feel you can overcome and refute the criticism, you may resubmit. So this is not as encouraging a letter, but it is not discouraging also, because it has these key phrases, which are, if you decide to resubmit, and if you can overcome and refute the criticism, you may resubmit. They are suggesting that it's a possibility, and so this is not a cause for alarm. It just suggests that you're going to need to make some major revisions, and you should definitely consider resubmitting. Laurent also said yesterday that if you don't get any kind of statement about resubmission, then that also should not discourage you from resubmitting. If you're going to get outright rejected, you're going to get something very terse and clear. Okay, so this is an outright rejection. The above manuscript has been reviewed by our referees. On this basis, we judge the paper is not appropriate for our journal, but might be suitable for publication in another journal. So if they're inviting you to resubmit to another journal, that's a good sign your paper has been resubmitted. And you should take advantage of this and listen to them, because I think fighting at this stage is unlikely, and it's likely to prolong the delay dramatically the publication of your paper. Okay, any questions about? So one of the things I want to talk about in the remainder of the talk is how to best respond to these referee remarks once you get them. And as I said, you want to avoid being emotional in responding, because that's not going to suit your purpose. And this is hard because your initial reaction is to be very unhappy and to be very emotional. That's illustrated by this example that I dug up that was published. This is an actual cover letter to the editor that was published in this Journal of Systems and Software. It was published by the editor to kind of as a way of describing the kinds of agony some authors go through in their publication. So this is the response. Dear Sir, Madam, or other, enclosed is our statement of latest version of manuscript, which is a revised revision of our paper. Choke on it. We have again rewritten the entire manuscript from start to finish. We even changed the running head. Hopefully we have suffered enough now to satisfy even you and the bloodthirsty reviewers. I shall skip the usual point-by-point description of every single change we made in response to the critiques. After all, it's fairly clear that your anonymous reviewers are less interested in the details of scientific procedure than in working out their personality problems and sexual frustrations by seeking some kind of demented glee in the sadistic and arbitrary exercise of tyrannical power over hapless authors like ourselves who happen to fall into their clutches. We do not understand that in the view of misanthropic psychopaths you have on your editorial, you need to keep sending them papers, for if they were not reviewing manuscripts, they would probably be out mugging little old ladies or clubbing baby seals to death. So, and it goes on. This is an actual letter. It was interesting to see the editor publish this, because they appreciate the kind of difficulty that authors have responding non-emotionally to this process. So one of the things I want to describe for you are some advice so that you don't come to this point and write a letter like this because you're so frustrated, but maybe you can navigate the review process and response process a bit better. So my first piece of advice, as I've already mentioned, is to take the referee comments seriously, even if you're not happy with them, even if you don't necessarily at first glance agree with them. As I said, when I reviewed this exchange between authors and referees, I found I often agreed after reading the paper with what the referee was saying, and somehow the author was not willing to appreciate the fact that usually it was on them that the reviewer was not understanding their paper. They weren't presenting things clearly enough. There was some gap in the logic they were using, and I saw that as the divisional editor, and the authors were not willing to say they were wrong. So ask yourself, when you get a referee comment, before just immediately responding negatively, ask yourself if you made your points clearly enough. Did your introduction emphasize the significance of your work? particularly if the review comments have to do with something like the importance of the paper. Sometimes it's difficult for you to actually tell this because you're so immersed in the subject, so you might want to ask a colleague who's in your field, a friend, to read the paper and judge for themselves, give you feedback based on what they think, because they're not quite as strongly immersed in the work as you are. Make sure when you respond to the referee reports, respond completely. And I think Julie said this already. Even if you don't want to make changes, respond and explain that you're not making any changes. This is the comment, so that people think that you are responding to all the comments. So you want to clearly number your responses: reviewer 1, comment 1, response, changes made, etc. If the referees make a useful comment, thank the referees for this. One reason to do this is that it forces you to think through the comments that are made. Even though you initially don't agree with them, you might think that after a while there's some validity to what they're saying. It also makes it clear to the editors and the referees that you are taking their responses and their comments seriously, and it also allows you to sort of separate. Sometimes the comments come in bulk form in terms of in the text, and you need to separate out separate comments that are kind of embedded in one paragraph. One thing to keep in mind when you're responding is there are usually more than one referee, and those referees will see the other reviewers' comments in the second round. And if it goes on later, if it goes to a divisional editor, the divisional editor will see everybody's responses. So you aren't necessarily responding just to the initial referee who made the comment. You're also responding to the other reviewers that will look at your paper, and you want to appear rational to those reviewers, because the editors and the reviewers are evaluating, as much as the content of what you're saying, the tone and the logical support you're providing for the arguments you're making. So here's a quick example. Referee A comment 2, here's the comment they made, here's the response. We thank the referee for this question, which helps us clarify the paper, and then the response. Changes made to the response. Make a specific statement of where in the text you made the change and what the change was. Referee A comment 2, here's the comment they made. In this case, they don't agree with the referee, but instead of saying the referee's an idiot, they say, with all due respect to the referee, I don't think this criticism is justified, and then they explain why. So this is a good, complete response to all of the different remarks. Respond to the referee reports politely. The idea here is to be persuasive, and you cannot be persuasive. Even a negative comment from a referee can be reversed if you provide politely an explanation for why the reviewer is wrong, and maybe own up to the fact that maybe you weren't quite as clear in your initial statement of the problem as you could have been. So, and this is certainly true of other reviewers that look at your paper. So one example of a bad exchange that I came across. So here's a bad referee report in the sense that they make a sarcastic remark. I cannot recommend this paper for publication if Israel of Letters, because essentially all the results in the paper have been published before. The author should be applauded for their courage to show figure 4 in the paper. This figure shows what has been known for a long time. And now the review goes on, is more extensive than this and has some substantive comments, but this kind of sarcastic remark is not helpful. Nevertheless, the author should ignore the sarcastic remark and respond logically to what the reviewer was saying, but instead they sort of escalated the situation with the following response. We do not understand why the referee cited 2 currently inconsistent results as his main ground for the rejection of the paper. Our result is not equivalent to the previous study. The referee ignored the fact that the previous study observed behavior different from ours. Such comments are misleading. So this is antagonistic language. You can say this much better. This is suggesting to the editors that the referee is being misleading and is ignoring things, and the reviewer has obviously feels they have no recourse but to double down on their original comment and make things worse. So in the second round, the reviewer says, in the first round, I refrained from using the term misleading, but since the authors accused me of being misleading, they left me no choice. The authors did not cite 3 recent papers. These papers deal with almost the same subject and report essentially of the same result. The authors did not cite these papers on purpose with a clear intention to mislead the editor, the referees, and the readers as to the novelty of their work. So things have obviously gotten much worse. So the author, however negative and improper the original referee report was, the authors did not help the situation by responding in the manner that they did. So respond politely, no matter how abrasive the reviewer might be. So avoid antagonizing phrases such as, we completely disagree with, the referee obviously doesn't know the field, the referee obviously didn't read the paper carefully, etc., and replace them with more conciliatory phrases, such as, we agree with the referee, however, with all due respect to the referee, we don't believe this point is correct, or we thank the referee for making the suggestion, we've made the following changes. So try to take the high road on your responses to avoid escalating a response between between the referee and the author. And that's true even if the reviewer uses impolite language. It's really up to you. It's in your best interest to be polite because you're trying to persuade the editors and the reviewers to reconsider your paper. Provide evidence to support your responses. So don't just dismiss a statement by saying we disagree and then moving on. You need to provide evidence. And that's particularly true if the reviewer doesn't provide any support for why they are rejecting your paper. Provide support in the same way that you would be expected to provide support for the scientific arguments you're making in your paper. So provide evidence in the paper. Consider whether you made the original, if they call out a particular argument you're making, ask yourself whether you made that argument clearly enough. Maybe the fault lies with you and your original presentation. If you think you did, is there additional evidence you can add to further support that point? And you can sprinkle your response letter to the editor with, if there are any positive remarks that the reviewers make, you can add those to your cover letter. So I'll close with some responses to ways of responding to different kinds of review comments that you might get. These are kind of common ones, and I won't bother to talk about positive reviews because you all know how to respond to those, but it's not uncommon to get a very terse referee comment, and I think this was brought up yesterday, with no supporting evidence. This is very frustrating, but actually, with some experience, you start to learn this is a good kind of negative report to get because it's very easy, it's much easier to respond to these kinds of reviews because they're not providing any evidence to support their position. So just respond politely and by reiterating your justifications. And as Julie mentioned, there is this section in your response where you can make a comment directly to the editor that is not seen by the authors. So don't tell the authors that they made a mistake by not justifying their response. That just escalates things. But you can make that comment to the editors so that it's not seen by the authors. But you should respond by reiterating your evidence and maybe reconsider whether you can add additional evidence in addition to that. Another common thing is that the 2 referee reports you get back have conflicting advice. One rejects, one doesn't reject. This is another, if you have to get a negative response, this is also a fairly good response to get because you have at least one reviewer which is supportive of your position. So you definitely need to completely and politely respond to the negative reviewer. But you also want to you want to reiterate and emphasize the positive comments of the positive reviewer, and maybe even mention that the positive reviewer didn't have the same kind of negative complaints that the negative reviewer had. You can point out to the editor in these comments intended for the editor that there's a disagreement, although they're probably likely to see this. But make sure you take seriously the negative reviewer's comments because maybe the reviewer who is negative is seeing something in your paper which is really problematic and that other readers might actually have if it gets out, if it's published, and that you can improve your paper with. Sometimes reviewers will change their responses in each round of the review, and this is also very frustrating. So in the first round, they will have a few comments, you respond to those comments, and the next round they have a completely different set of comments, and it's very frustrating. Don't assume they're out to get you and they're just trying to trash your paper, because maybe they just missed something in the first review, and they found something which is legitimately an issue, and that you should respond to. But in case they are just trying to have serial problems with your paper, you could mention to the editors in this section where you write to the editors that aren't seen by the authors. You can comment on this tendency for the reviewer to come up with different comments in each round. If the referee missed some obvious points you thought you made, don't say that the reviewer didn't read your paper or is missing something. Consider the possibility again that your paper was not clearly stated in that point. Ask a colleague to read the paper to make sure you're making your point clearly enough, and then just respond politely to the referee again, indicating how you clarified your points. Now, if the referee is just wrong, you want to the criticisms politely, but you also want to do it with supporting evidence. You don't want to just say that they're wrong and move on. You want to explain why they're wrong. You also want to reconsider, again, how you can improve your argument so that another reader doesn't miss the point in the same way the referee did. And finally, if the referee is rude, which occasionally happens, although it gets filtered to some extent by the editor, don't respond in kind. This is just going to frustrate your efforts to get your paper published. Ignore rude comments. Remember, at this stage, you're probably not writing your response for that referee. You're writing your response for other reviewers and the editors who are going to be reading this exchange, and talk rationally and logically so that they'll see you as taking the high road in this discussion. But you can point out to the editor in this comments for the editor-only section that you found these comments rude and inappropriate. So just to conclude with the main points, I think the bottom line is that you should always take the review comments seriously. And it's not always easy, because your initial reaction, because your paper is not immediately accepted, is that you're unhappy and this is not the outcome you were hoping for. And sometimes they're going to see problems in your paper that seem obvious to you, but that may be because you're immersed in the research and you haven't clearly expressed to a more general audience what your points are. So take the comments seriously and use them as an opportunity to improve your paper. Respond to the referee comments politely and completely, even if you don't agree with the comments and even if the comments are antagonistic. And make sure initially your introduction, abstract, and conclusions clearly communicate your main points, your motivation, your punchline. And again, it may be helpful to have somebody who's a friend outside your field provide you some feedback on whether you're effectively doing this in your first draft before you submit, because you can avoid problems down the road in the editorial process if you polish your paper as much as possible beforehand. So with that, I will take any questions you have.
Questions? Nobody has questions about the referees? Are you sure? Please.
Thank you. When you receive a rude response for the referees, for instance, where do you think that is appropriate for the editor to look at it, to look at this end, at this response? Do you think that is necessary to make a second, take a second opinion, or just put it forward and try to see what the author is going to do, or something like this?
Well, I think, as was discussed yesterday, the reviewers get grades for their responses. So it's likely if it's really rude, they'll get a grade for this for later on. Some of the responses are not so rude, and if they're really rude, they will probably be edited by the editors before they're sent out. But there are some comments that are not exactly rude, but they are a little bit antagonistic. So they're not enough to be filtered, but you're still going to see them and get upset with them. So I think you just ignore them and look at any substantive points that they're making. But then if you did find something offensive, you can comment on this in this. But I wouldn't comment to the authors, the reviewers directly. I would comment to the editors instead, because you're trying to persuade the reviewer. So this might go back to that original reviewer, and you don't want to do what this previous author did that I showed you and just make things worse. You want to try to respond positively. But you do want to make it clear to the editors you're not happy with what that response was. But the really rude ones are usually filtered. But there's still these sort of slightly antagonistic or sarcastic remarks that can really be upsetting to you, but wouldn't necessarily be filtered by the editors. And those things you just have to ignore and then focus on the logical arguments you want to make.
It's more about your presentation of yesterday. Can you say how should we properly present equations during the text, and how to make it the appearance of the equations clear enough during the phrases or something like this, if you have some tips about it?
Well, it might be better to talk to a theorist about how they do this, but I think that particularly for a really general audience, you really want to minimize the details in the equations. As opposed to your own notebook where you have this extremely detailed with comments. But in the paper, you want to focus on the main point, because this is a paper that's going to be read by a broader audience, not necessarily a group of theorists. So and this is a judgment call. What is essential to understand the point of your paper, the big picture of your paper, and which equations are not needed for that. So a common way people do this, I think, is have an appendix where they have some of the more detailed calculations, or supplementary material where they bury the detailed calculations, but they put very few equations actually in the text itself. But I think it's a judgment call. You have to decide what is really necessary to understand the paper and what things can be relegated to the supplement or to an appendix.
We have one more question. Dori?
Thank you. Good morning. Sometimes you get a report from the referee that requests several changes to your paper. Many sometimes. And when you reply then and you send to the editor and together with a cover letter, how detailed you must be concerning this change in this letter? You must really, we change the comma in line 35, or, how detailed you must be?
Well, it depends on how substantive the comments are. If they are pointing out typographical errors, I don't think you need to go into detail. You just need to say So many times when I write a referee report, I will comment on specific grammatical errors or something, and the response will be, we've made those changes, and that's fine. If it's a substantive issue, you need to explain. I think you do need to explain in detail about what you're doing, because if one possibility is if the editors believe that you've made the changes the reviewers have suggested, they may think it's not necessary to send it out for review. So that's one reason to be detailed in your responses, so that the editors can see that, yeah, you took it seriously and you adopted it. They may still send it out, but they may not, depending on how thorough you are in your response. But really trivial issues like grammatical errors and typographical errors, I don't think you need to respond to.
We have Mark, one more question there. Do you have the Sami?
Okay, thank you very much. I do have one simple question. Who decides finally? I mean, only reviewers or editors also have the mandate to do so?
Had the mandate to do what?
To make the decision, I mean,
Oh.
whether a submitted paper to be accepted or not.
Well, in the case of regular anonymous reviewers, they're providing advice to the editors. So it's the editors who make the final decision. In the case of the divisional editor, they're making a final decision. But all the reviewers' comments are providing advice for the editors who are the ones who were mandated to make the final decision.
Okay, thanks.
Do we have more questions? Think not. So let's thank Lance again. Thank you, Lance.